Today's broadcast is on the nature of truth and the controversy of something called dialetheism. This is a very surface-level take on the concept, and entirely described within the very tight bounds of poetic, natural language. We will walk a tightrope on the line of purples, perhaps even venturing into purple prose. A dialetheistic statement is a self-contradictory statement that still rings true within the system itself, or at least from a certain grammatical perspective. This ringing of truth might end upon the introduction of a superior system, or it might perhaps ring on indefinitely without the chance of being disproved. Usually, there isn't a superior system to answer our meta-question. Dialetheistic statements are like the art of M.C. Escher, and is impossible waterfalls, but done with language, rather than by painting with projective geometry. A dialetheism is not unlike an aphorism. An aphorism is like a basic statement about some scientific truth, often portrayed in a very poetic manner. One might call it a truthful preposition. An aphorism is much like a hologram, whereas a dialetheism is more like an impossible form. A dialetheism is when two seemingly true concepts appear to contradict one another, once combined into what can be called a single statement. Often, this contradiction is nothing more than an illusion of language. Other times, you may find yourself believing that two things can truly contradict, and yet still both exist. If you have two beliefs that contradict or are contrary to one another, we call this cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance can be very painful, but consonance isn't always what it's cracked up to be either. As made audible by the followers of post-tonal music theory, people often experience cognitive dissonance when they do something that goes against their ethics or religion. This is much like the concept of chirality. Benjamin Franklin describes the political process as operating in a contrarian way. He often remarked that the people heard it and approved the doctrine, and then immediately practiced the contrary. Alas, the agent involved might be entirely unaware of their contradictory or self-contrarian beliefs. They might see value in a contradiction, although there isn't much insight when the cognitive dissonance involves a contrary instead. Such perhaps contradictory views can be a sign of enlightenment. Many attack the defenders of dialetheistic beliefs by claiming it is circular, but so might be the logical framework found in the Eightfold Path of Buddhism. Such iconoclastic beliefs would stand entirely opposed to the idea of science being some kind of computation that would map a statement to either a true or a false value. Can something be both true and false? Niels Bohr claims that the opposite of a correct statement is a false statement, but the opposite of a profound truth may well be another profound truth. This seems to agree with the dialetheistic perspective. Critics of dialetheism would say that the impossible is the result of an illusion, and that the illusion is symbolic of an error in grammar. There are some very valid criticisms to the dialetheistic point of view. When two statements clash, like with that of dialetheism, most kinds of contemporary logic tend to call this occasion an exploded middle. One can imagine the two aphoristic statements crashing into one another and exploding into a big bang. From that explosion, anything can follow. The system of judgment seems to disagree with itself, thereby self-destructing. Paraconsistent logic attempts to sidestep this issue. Paraconsistent logic is also called inconsistency-tolerant logic, or at least is seemingly similar to it. Paraconsistent logic is not unlike circular logic, which has its time and place in various areas of mathematics. Dialetheists and their paraconsistent logic reject the principle of explosion as a universal truth, often by phoning it into a metasystem. When we are faced with a contradiction, often there is no solution except to label the system as something along the lines of inconsistent or incomplete. On the other hand, a skilled poet can use a dialetheism to get across a message from the higher order. This includes signals that our so-called natural language would not otherwise be able to relay without such poetic contradictions. To quote Robert Heinlein, a paradox may be paradoctored. Some critics of dialetheistic logic also draw reference to something called the square of opposition. This shows a relation between four basic categorical propositions. Be prepared. This is a bit of a mouthful, but we'll explain it shortly. The first basic whatchamacallit is that all x are y. The second basic proposition is that no x are y. The third is that some x are y. And finally, that some x are not y. Together, they have four different kinds of relationships when we compare them in a pair. A contrary might be like saying all hippies love water, while also claiming that all hippies hate water. This is because one statement is contrary to the other, but there's surprisingly no contradiction. This is because both statements can be false, as they are phrased now, but both cannot be true, at least without some extra context sprinkled in to clarify. After all, hippies are environmentalists that do not like to bathe. As John Lennon puts it, it's weird not to be weird. A subaltern is like claiming that some scientists are mad scientists, while also saying that all scientists are mad scientists. Since some is a smaller subset of all, there isn't a contradiction or contrary. There is also no negation. The word subaltern has also been used by Marxists to describe the lower castes of imperialist societies. A subcontrary would be like saying some dudes want to rock, whereas some dudes don't want to rock. Thereby, two crude dudes might have different attitudes, but at least there is no rude conflict. A contradiction, however, would be like saying all numbers are computable, while also claiming that some numbers are not computable. Notice how the language shifts from all to a comparison of only some. Either one of the other statements is false, especially due to the negation involved. Most critics say that even if dialetheisms were legitimate claims, the two beliefs would not be contradictions. Rather, they would be subcontrary claims shrouded in grammar. As stated, this is like saying some elements of X are Y, and some elements of X are not Y. Consider this seemingly dialetheistic quote by Gandhi. Whatever you do will be insignificant, but it is very important that you do it. It seems like a contrary, but really it is either a contradiction or a subcontrary. Notice how it shifts from doing whatever to doing it, as it may be considered a smaller subset of whatever. Now we can see that the quote clearly isn't a contrary, but is rather a contradiction or perhaps a subcontrary disguised as a contradiction. A fan of paraconsistent logic would say that everything being insignificant and some things being important are contradictory, and still be perfectly happy with that quote. A critic of paraconsistent logic would say the quote is only a subcontrary. The supersets in the top two basic propositions would then use the word everyone, and the smaller subset would be signified by the word you. This would imply that the word whatever and the word it are interchangeable in the quote, and refer to any single action. Suddenly, the grammar doesn't seem so volatile. In this case, we have shown that what we thought was a contradiction was maybe just a subcontrary that needed extra context, or ambient space. Other dialetheisms are not so easy to excuse as just another subcontrary, but still perhaps speak in a roundabout truth all the same. As Heraclitus puts it, one of the great constants in life is change. To excuse this statement as a subcontrary, we need to instead consider the differences between quasi-periodic invariance, periodic invariance, and variance. We will investigate this in another episode. Just remember to keep an open mind while we dive into the nature of change. After all, if you can't change your perception, then you are impossible to convince. If you are impossible to convince, then sometimes all you can do is change your perception. Thank you.